Today on CityCast Boise. Pastor Doug Wilson has been a polarizing figure in Idaho for decades. But when Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth shared a controversial Wilson interview on social media, the tacit endorsement raised questions about how much influence Idaho's Christian nationalist movement has in Washington. It's Monday, August 25th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me to break down this topic is Heath Drusen, the host of the Extremely American podcast. Thanks so much for being here today, Heath.
Great to be here again, Lindsay.
For listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain who Doug Wilson is and why he's become such a central figure in conversations about Christian nationalism and Christian theocracy?
Yeah, why are we talking about this pastor of a church in a town of 25,000 people, right? It's on the surface, it seems super weird. But Doug Wilson, he is the pastor of a church in Moscow, Idaho. University of Idaho is there. People in Idaho will probably be very familiar. People outside of Idaho might not, except Doug Wilson also leads sort of this global Christian industrial complex, as my friend James Dawson over at Boise State Public Radio coined, a great term. And this complex, it's churches around the country, it's schools around the country, it's a media empire, a Christian nationalist media empire. And Doug Wilson has extreme views, even for sort of super conservative evangelicism, very extreme views. He doesn't think women should be able to vote. He doesn't think the Confederacy was that bad. He kind of soft pedals slavery. Gays, in his mind, should be criminalized, basically, for just living their lives. But essentially, we're talking about Doug Wilson because he's got this national and even global empire where he's spreading these views through media, churches, and schools. And now he's having a moment because he bet on Trump. Trump won. And he is starting to get his people either in high places or certainly has the ear of people in high places. And that includes the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, I highly recommend anybody who wants to do more of a deeper dive, check out the second season of Extremely American. That gives a lot more background into Doug Wilson, into Christ Church, into all of this that we're going to be talking about. But specifically, I wanted you on, Heath, because in a recent CNN interview that made international headlines, it's still making headlines, Wilson and other pastors from his denomination talked about how women need to be submitting to their husbands, that they want to get rid of women's right to vote, among other controversial topics. And Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, shared that interview on his personal social media with the caption, quote, "All of Christ for all of life," which is a slogan for embracing Christianity in every facet of society, including government. So what should people understand about the significance of a government official amplifying that message?
Pete Hegseth, as the Secretary of Defense, runs the largest department in the federal government. You could argue he's the most important person in the cabinet just by his position. So what he is doing there is he is supporting Doug Wilson's extreme views. All of Christ for all of life is Wilson's motto. And as you said, it means the separation. What it really means is the separation of church and state doesn't exist because Doug Wilson doesn't think it should exist. Pete Hegseth certainly doesn't think it does either. And I say that based not only on him supporting Doug Wilson, but on his actions recently. So it's extremely significant because you have someone who's in charge of the military, an extremely diverse organization with a growing percentage of women who now make up almost 1 in 5 members of the military. And their leader is boosting an interview where a guy he respects and admires very publicly says that not only should women be submissive to men, but they shouldn't even be able to vote. They should lose arguably their most important constitutional right. So what does that tell members of the military, right? It's a really good question. And it's a little bit hard to know that because members of the military by law are not supposed to be political publicly, at least not in uniform. And so, yeah, but you really wonder, like, what kind of message is that sending to non-Christians or even Christians who aren't in his worldview? What is it sending to women, the LGBTQ community? There's a lot of questions.
And what exactly is Pete Hegseth's connection to Doug Wilson's, what did you call it? The Christian industrial complex or the Christian nationalism industrial complex?
Yeah, the Christian industrial complex. Yes.
Yeah, because he has the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, or CREC, which is basically that complex. How is Hegseth connected to all of this?
Right. The CREC, or CREC, as a lot of people refer to it, is an umbrella group of churches around the country that share Doug Wilson's severe view of Christianity. Pete Hegseth does attend one of his churches, sends his kids to one of Doug Wilson's schools. Up until recently, that was all in Tennessee. Most recently, Hegseth attended services at Doug Wilson's newest church, which is in Washington, D.C. And not only that, but in case you're wondering, like, well, maybe he goes to the church but doesn't support the man's ideas in full. Pete Hegseth has appeared on Doug Wilson-affiliated media shows saying that Doug Wilson's writings have inspired him and have really been influential. And I have read some of Doug Wilson's writings, and they are pretty clear that women are second-class citizens, should be in charge, and that women should be barred from all kinds of things. Like we said, voting was one of them, and they shouldn't hold government positions either. So, it's pretty hard to separate the two when Hegseth's been so explicit about his support for Doug Wilson.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting that when pushed, the Pentagon initially didn't give a straight answer when they were asked whether Hegseth supports women's right to vote. What does that non-answer tell us about his relationship to Wilson's theology, or how much he's willing to explain that relationship?
Yeah, Slate specifically asked the Pentagon if Hegseth supports the right of women to vote. And as you said, their initial response was to ignore the question and sort of double down and be like, well, Hegseth is a proud member of Doug Wilson's church organization. Later, the Pentagon issued another statement, and it said that, of course, he supports the right of women to vote. But Hegseth hasn't said anything, and it's like, you got to wonder, why is it so hard to answer this very basic question? Because, of course, women should have the right to vote. That is broadly agreed upon in America. It's also agreed upon by the Constitution. The 19th Amendment, of course, guarantees that. So what does it say? I mean, it says, hey, I want to disenfranchise 20% of the military, for one thing, not to mention 50% of the country, or at least it says I'm wishy-washy on the issue. And I can't imagine that helps morale among not only women, of course, but the vast majority of men in the military who I'm sure do not agree that women should not be able to vote. So, yeah, it's an extreme view. I mean, there's no other way to look at it, right? I mean, that's about as extreme as it gets. Like, it's not something that's on the table. That would, like, it's not an argument. We argue about things in politics, like the Electoral College, or even abortion. Obviously, a huge hot button issue, but we argue about it sometimes in good faith. Even the right of women to vote, that one that should not be up for debate.
Yeah. And like you said, you mentioned morale, but I have to also wonder how it could affect recruitment. If the Secretary of Defense is sharing this extremist messaging, the military is a very diverse group of people. What kind of messaging does that send? It's a very top-down organization as well. And so you have to wonder how that will affect conversations within that group, or the temperature. And I think it could have a very big impact on both morale and recruitment.
It's an excellent point. The military is a religiously and racially diverse group. And now you've got a guy who is sort of hitting all of the low points in trying to reach out to those. He's telling women, and that he supports a guy who doesn't think they should be able to vote. So yeah, if you're a woman, that probably gives you some serious pause about joining the military. And that's not to mention the vast majority of people who join the military who do not share Doug Wilson's severe views of Christianity. And I'm including a lot of Christians in there too, because of course Wilson, who Pete Hegseth admires, also doesn't think Mormons are real Christians. He doesn't think Catholics are real Christians. That's to say nothing of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and atheists. And yes, there are atheists in foxholes, unlike the old adage. There's all kinds in the military. And I say this as someone who covered the military for the better part of a decade, including a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was side by side with troops out in war zones a lot. So I'm speaking from some experience. Yeah. And you know what? That makes a strong military. Like, that helps them get their recruiting goals. And that also helps them get a military that reflects America. And if you're going to have this serious Christian nationalist vision, that's only going to appeal to a narrow set of people. Now, they might be ardent supporters, but that, I think, long term really threatens recruitment.
Now, in this interview and other interviews, Doug Wilson has said that the 19th Amendment was a bad idea. Women being able to vote was a bad idea. But he lets, I hate that I have to phrase it this way, he lets his wife and daughters vote. What do you think this contradiction reveals about his motives and maybe even his leadership style?
Well, to be honest, I think it shows you that he's pretty smart. Because he doesn't think they should be able to vote, but he also believes in winning. And he knows that while women do have the right to vote, that he wants the women who believe what he believes to go to those booths. Yeah, I mean, he's a pragmatic guy. I've spent hours talking to Doug Wilson, and his views are extreme, often offensive, but you should not underestimate him because he is not stupid. And he certainly will not lose just to sort of make a point like that. He thinks you should flex your power as much as you can, and eventually use that power to strip women of the right to vote. But in that case, he'd be stripping all women of the right to vote, not to mention a lot of other people too. And basically, if he got his way, he would have a hand-picked electorate that would support a lot of the things that he supported anyway. So yeah, I mean, he's being smart, to be honest.
Yeah, it feels a lot like those women who hold positions of power. We even have some in the Idaho legislature who have said that women shouldn't be in the legislature. They should not be in leadership positions. And they say that from the position of being a leader and saying that they hope they can make changes so that women can't be leaders in the future. It feels along the same vein as that. Do you think that is part of how Christian nationalism sells itself as more palatable while still working to undermine people's rights behind the scenes?
Doug Wilson's interesting. And Pete Hegseth sort of reflects this a little bit. In a lot of ways, he doesn't care what people think. Like, he pushes ideas that are extreme. But then he does try in some ways to soft pedal it. And you know what he does well is he tries to make himself out to be the counterculture and kind of like, hey, I'm rebellious and cool, which is kind of crazy because he's a fundamentalist, extremist Christian who's like pushing a theocracy, but he is wrapping it in this cool veneer, and he's pretty good at that. And I will say, I've noticed that in Pete Hegseth's approach. Like, he's got slick marketing. He's got like good music in the ads, or at least like exciting music in the ads. I don't know if it's that good, but whatever, it works. He's got like troops kicking ass, and like, I'm not saying that it's everybody's cup of tea, because it's not. And that's why I'm saying I think this will alienate some people. But like, he's got good production values, and Doug Wilson does too. And like with women, one thing Doug Wilson does is he doesn't actually say, I think women shouldn't be able to vote. He says, I think households should vote, as in the head of the household in consultation with the other people in the household. But who is the head of the household in Doug Wilson's mind? Spoiler alert, it's the man.
And Wilson just opened a new church in Washington, D.C. Now we see Pete Hegseth publicly promoting his ideology. From your reporting on Doug Wilson in the Extremely American podcast, isn't this exactly what Wilson has been building towards? Like, he didn't just want to build a theocracy in Moscow, Idaho. He wanted to build into the halls of power in Washington, right?
And that's exactly what he's doing. It's a major flex. So Donald Trump won. Doug Wilson opened a church in DC, right in the heart of DC power structure. It is 100% by design. Like, this is our moment. People who will listen to us are in the White House and in Congress, and we need to be there too. And it's smart. The Secretary of Defense went to church there. That's big. If nothing else, even if it means nothing else, it's a huge symbol. And that's something that Doug Wilson can use to attract people. It's something he can use to attract money. If there's people on the the far edges of the Christian right who have money and are like, maybe this guy can help us achieve our goal. So yeah, it's if you listen, as you said, like if you listen to the podcast, if you listen to the second season of Extremely American, Doug Wilson is laying this out. He's not shy about it. I sat down with him for 5 hours and he told me, and this was all before the election. And then it was like, oh wow, it's all happening. It's all happening now. And there was no reason not to know about it because Doug Wilson said exactly what he was going to do, and now he's doing it.
And how do you think that this publicity and a location in Washington, D.C. changes Wilson's influence? Is this the moment? You know, we can call him extreme. We can call his views severe. But is this the moment when he jumps from fringe to mainstream?
Oh, he's jumped. He is influencing people at the very top of the power structure in America. So in that way, he is very mainstream. I will say it's always a double-edged sword with him, though, because, and this is important for people to remember, because I think sometimes with Doug Wilson, the notoriety and the connections to power can make people think that a lot of people agree with him. But he's not important because he's popular. He's important because he knows how to get to people in power. His ideas are broadly unpopular. And I think Americans need to remember that. Like, Doug Wilson can be on CNN saying women shouldn't vote all he wants. Americans do not agree with that. Americans do not agree with most Christian nationalist ideas. They are extremely unpopular in poll after poll. The problem for people who don't agree with those ideas is that Doug Wilson is able to circumvent a popular election, which Doug Wilson has never won, and his people haven't really won. Pete Hegseth didn't win an election, he was appointed. But he can circumvent that because he's getting his people in power or people who will listen to him in power. And so he can just go directly to the White House and directly to Congress and be like, hey, like, these are our ideas. You should listen to them. And he's a persuasive guy. So that might work.
So with the nation having this conversation about this Idaho pastor from Moscow, with the rise of Christian nationalism in our country, especially now in DC, with Doug Wilson's influence and Pete Hegseth's public support, what does the average Idahoan, what does the average American need to understand about where this movement is headed?
I think they should take it very seriously. It's in DC wielding power. And I think Idahoans need to pay attention to that, but also on the state level and the local level, you've got people with Christian nationalist ideas who are trying to take power all across the board. They're targeting library boards, they're targeting city councils, they're targeting the legislature. they're patient and they're dogged and they vote. And so they'll target these low turnout elections like local boards, city councils, things like that, because they know that if they can get their people out in numbers, they have a chance, even if the community doesn't totally agree with them. So pay attention, vote in your local elections, see who's running, see what their ideas are. If you don't like Christian nationalist ideas, then, press your candidates on that and see if that's who they are. Because sometimes they will run and sort of try to pretend that they're not as extreme as they really are, which is a good tactic because, as I said, most people don't like these ideas.
Well, Heath, I want to thank you so much. Christian nationalism can feel very abstract, and people see, like a shocking interview clip and think, that's so wild. I can't believe someone would say that. But like you said, it is rippling in our communities right now, in Boise, in Meridian, in the Treasure Valley, and having an actual impact on things that matter to us. So I really appreciate you taking the time to break it down and give us some insight into what you found out about Doug Wilson with your reporting.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Great talking to you.
Before we go, one of the perks of being a CityCast Boise neighbor is that you get a chance to shout out your favorite local business or nonprofit. And one of our neighbors, Frank M., gave a shout out to the Boise Salvation Army for all of the services they provide our community. Be like Frank. You can join our membership program for $10 a month by going to membership.citycast.fm. That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure and tell your friends about the show. We'll be back tomorrow morning with a look at why Idahoans are moving out of the state. Catch you then.